Before I start, let me say a few words about my motivation for picking this topic. So those of you who may be familiar with my earlier work may be surprised by this choice of topic, because most of my earlier work focused on the distributional effects of trade liberalization, so trying to identify winners and losers that arise as a result of trade liberalization. So in contrast, this talk is going to focus more on the aggregate gains from trade. In these days, with the financial crisis and the worldwide recession looming over us, most people might think trade is not that important. In fact, it's even worse. A direct consequence of this crisis was that there is a new protectionist sentiment on the rise. To give you one concrete example, the 2009 Recovery Act in the US has a Buy American clause that specifically forbids spending on public works unless all of the iron, steel, and manufactured goods used in the project are produced in the United States. So this clause makes one worry that the firms that are engaged in these projects may not be having access to the best inputs, or even if they do so, they may not be getting the best prices. And of course, this is a concern in the United States, but I would argue this is much more of a concern in developing countries where limited access to high-quality intermediate inputs is much more of an issue. So this concern was certainly acknowledged by policymakers in developing countries in the past. So here is a citation from the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So this statement was made in 2008, before the crisis gathered momentum. And referring to the trade liberalization of the 90s, the Deputy Governor said that the trade liberalization and tariff reforms have provided increased access to Indian companies to the best inputs available globally at almost world prices. So against this background, I thought I would use this podium to provide some more formal analysis to back the statement made by the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and more generally make a case for trade. So most economists tend to believe, at least they did so until a few months ago, that free markets and therefore free trade are conducive to growth. And in fact, we can find many arguments in the theoretical literature that provide arguments of why this would be so. And so these arguments traditionally emphasize the efficiency gains that arise from trade. These gains can arise from specialization and or selection. They emphasize the benefits of scale and competition, and they also emphasize what I'm going to focus on today, namely access to new technology, intermediate and capital goods. On the other hand, you can also find in the theory plenty of arguments that would suggest that trade and trade liberalization may have potentially adverse effects. And I'm thinking here primarily of models with imperfect competition, infant industry arguments, but also in the context of developing countries, models that show that if you have a developing country that has a comparative advantage in a sector like agriculture or mining that are considered to be less dynamic, by specializing in these sectors, the long-run growth rate in these countries may be reduced. So I think it's fair to say that the theoretical results are ambiguous, and therefore it's not surprising that people turn to empirical work, try to find out what the data suggests. Now, it's well known by now that the evidence on this issue has been inconclusive and I would say highly contentious. This evidence is mostly based on cross-country studies, and these have been reviewed so many times that I don't want to spend too much time reviewing these studies. I will just mention briefly the four main reasons that these studies have not offered conclusive evidence, and I list these reasons in order of declining importance. The first issue is that there are enormous measurement problems when one compares data across countries. Measurement problems are present in every application in economics, but I would argue that these problems are much more severe when they involve cross-country comparisons. And these data problems, these measurement problems, concern the primary variable of interest, which is the measurement of openness. And usually, this is not always true in these studies, but very often openness is reduced to a single index that is supposed to capture a variety of different measures. The measurement problems also affect the measures of income and growth that are crucial in these regressions, but also the variables that we tend to believe are determinants of growth. So, for example, you might think that a high school degree would mean something completely different in Mongolia compared to France. Okay, so, and I would argue these problems are extremely hard to overcome. That's why I list them as the number one issue in this type of studies. The second issue is the one of reverse causality and intermediate variable bias, and this, again, has a lot to do with what kind of openness measure one uses. So if you use a measure such as imports or exports, obviously these measures are blatantly endogenous. Now, to be fair to this literature, people have made considerable progress addressing these issues by using better data sets, employing clever instruments, and so on. So I think this is something that can be potentially overcome. A third argument that people made is that trade policies alone cannot promote growth unless they're combined with other measures. For example, in many developing countries, labor markets are extremely rigid, so trade liberalization cannot have positive effects on growth unless it's accompanied by deregulation of labor markets. Again, this is something that in principle can be addressed, although sometimes it's hard to do it in a very comprehensive cross-country study. And a fourth argument, again, this is something that can be addressed, and I'll try to do that today, is that many of the cross-country studies focused on data that predate the major trade liberalization of the 90s that many developing countries experienced. And I would argue that these trade liberalization episodes in the 90s provide an ideal experiment in order to study the effects of trade on growth. So I don't, as I said before, I don't want to spend more time on this, partly because I list a few studies that offered critical reviews of this literature. I think the review of this literature has been comprehensive and extensive, and partly because I think the tone of these reviews has been extremely negative. So almost every paper that is written on this subject has the goal of criticizing the studies. Of course, we will know what these problems are without having these studies. So instead of doing that, I would like to take the discussion in a more positive direction and focus on an alternative strategy that I think might be more promising in informing our understanding on what promotes growth. And this would involve a shift of focus from the macro-based towards micro-based evidence. By this I mean two things. First, I mean a shift in focus on specific mechanisms rather than specific macroeconomic outcomes. So rather than asking the question, does trade promote growth at the macroeconomic level, focus on the question, what particular mechanisms that are suggested by theory work and in which cases. And that has to go hand in hand with a shift of focus on particular countries and trade liberalization episodes, because different mechanisms are going to work in different settings, and the very same mechanism may not work in different settings. So, as I said before, instead of arguing these things in abstract, I'm going to focus on a very particular channel that has received a lot of attention, at least in the theoretical literature, and this concerns the access to intermediate and capital goods. So before I go on, let me briefly mention what I consider to be the advantages and disadvantages of this approach. So I think the main advantage is that one hopes that the results are going to be more credible, partly because the focus is more narrow, and this allows one to do a better job in addressing some of these measurement problems that I mentioned before. Of course, the measurement problems are also going to be present in data that are country-specific or in microdata, but at least because the scope of the analysis is more narrow, one has a better chance of addressing these problems successfully. Also, as I will discuss in a moment, the identification strategy in these cases can be more credible. A second advantage, which I think is an important one, is I would argue that these mechanisms are a step closer to the policy-relevant question, which is what is it that policymakers should do in order to promote growth. Okay, and ultimately, it's the policy that motivates all this literature. So if you have, for example, a study that shows that a country that's landlocked is going to grow more slowly than a country that has access to the sea, then there is not much you can do about that as a policymaker. I mean, the obvious implication is that the landlocked country should annex the country that has access to the sea, so Austria should annex Italy. But beyond that, there is not much you can do, right? While if you show that there are particular mechanisms that policymakers can affect, for example, tariffs on intermediate inputs, that those kind of policies can have an effect on growth, then the connection to policy is much more immediate. The obvious disadvantage is that this approach is much more limited in scope. By focusing, for example, in this talk on intermediate and capital goods and on India, I can only say what worked in the case of the Indian trade liberalization. And of course, one cannot extrapolate from this to what might happen in China or in the US or other countries, right? So the external validity is a major issue when one adopts this approach. This doesn't mean, in my view, that one shouldn't be doing these studies. In contrast, I think we need many more of these studies, and then at the end we can put them together and we can conduct a comparative analysis. So cross-country comparisons, but cross-country comparisons that are not based on cross-country regressions, but rather on comparisons of econometrically informed case studies that focus on particular countries. Okay, so I would also like to make clear that I'm certainly not the first and not the only one to be advocating this type of approach when it comes to growth. Rather, I consider myself to be part of a growing community of people who focus more and more on microdata and a micro approach in order to address questions that concern growth. And this community would include all people who have done studies on the sectoral effects of trade liberalization on total factor productivity. And there are numerous such studies. More recently, there has been a literature that focuses specifically on the microdeterminants of growth. And we'll talk about this later today, I guess. There's a session later that is titled, What Do We Know About Growth? So in some sense, you can view this talk as a warm-up for this session. So there is the work, for example, by Sen Klinow that asks the question, why does total factor productivity differ between plants in China and India and the US? And their answer is that capital is not allocated efficiently across plants in India or China. So they come to this conclusion by exploiting microdata on plants in India and China. There is another study by Bloom and Van Reenen who essentially ask the same question, but they focus on the importance of managerial practices, again looking at plant-level data. So these studies do not look specifically at the question of openness or trade, but they do employ microdata and they do focus on micro-mechanisms in order to understand growth. A study that perhaps closer in spirit to what I'm talking about today is one again by Bloom and Van Reenen that asks specifically the question, how does trade, and in particular imports from China, affect the incentives of firms in developed countries to adopt innovation and information technology? And again, to answer this question, they use extremely detailed plant-level data. So in spirit, what I'm going to talk about is going to be very close to this study, except I'm going to focus on intermediate inputs rather than final goods. And I'm going to argue that these intermediate inputs are arguably more important in developing countries than they are in developed countries. So with that in mind, let me give you a brief roadmap of the rest of the talk. So I'll start by providing a theoretical framework that is going to be useful in thinking about the empirical issues. And then I will talk about the difficulties that one has in bringing the theory to the data. And then I will focus on the advantages we have these days. I already gave those away. Number one, we have more disaggregated data at the plant or firm level. And second, we have these trade liberalization episodes in developing countries. So at this point, let me also make clear that when I talk about a micro approach to growth, I'm not suggesting here that we are conducting randomized trials. I mean, this approach has also been suggested in a different context. I have absolutely nothing against randomized trials, but the nature of the questions that have to do with trade liberalization is such that we don't have the option of conducting randomized trials. So you cannot assign tariff rates randomly to different countries or different sectors and see how the governments or the firms are going to respond. So we do not have this option. And I will argue that the next best we can do to address questions of causality is to focus on these trade liberalization episodes that we have in developing countries. So you can consider that to be the second best. And again, I will, as I said before, I will focus mostly on the case of India, but I will also try to indicate, when possible, how this approach can be applied to other countries as well. So the starting point, the starting theoretical point, is provided by the endogenous growth model literature. Now, there are many different versions of these models, but I think it's fair to say that one common theme across all these models is that new varieties and new products play a very important role in growth. Conceptually, one can distinguish between two effects in this literature. The first effect is the level or static effect. So in the context of intermediate or capital goods, this effect would imply that new intermediate or capital goods lead to an increase in measured TFP. And the connection to trade there is immediate. If you have trade, you have imports of new intermediate and capital goods, and this is going to lead in this type of models to an increase to a one-time increase in total factor productivity. So this is the static effect, and most people would think that this static effect is important, but it's not really the reason we care about trade. Most people would think that the dynamic effects, the growth effects of trade might be more important. And in this type of models, these effects arise essentially from a linkage between the new variety creation and research activity. So the basic idea is that as productivity increases because of the static effect, the rate of variety of new product creation will increase too. So you don't have just a one-time increase in income, you also have an increase in the growth rate. So the simplest possible model to illustrate this effect is the model I wrote up there. So it's a model where you have a final sector. The output of the sector is denoted by Y, and this final output is produced by three inputs. There is capital, labor, and there is an intermediate input, X, and these are combined based on a Cobb-Douglas production function. A is the total factor productivity, and the intermediate input sector itself is comprised from a set of, to use the jargon in this literature, different varieties that are denoted by I. Okay. Now, let's assume that at the beginning we have n such varieties, and if you assume if one believes the standard assumptions of these type of models, monopolistic competition, standard preferences, then one gets complete symmetry. So the inputs, the output of each input, xi, is going to be the same across all inputs, and this is going to simplify the algebra. So using this very simple, by the way, this, I forgot to mention that these intermediate inputs, these different varieties, are combined to this aggregate input using a CES aggregator with elasticity of substitution sigma that's greater than 1. Okay? So by using this very simple specification, one can decompose total output growth into 4 components. There is the growth in the factor inputs, so growth in capital, labor, and the intermediate input, and then there is the growth in measured factor productivity, so AM. And then this growth in measured total factor productivity can be further decomposed in the growth of the pure total factor productivity, so this measure that essentially reflects, among other things, technology, and then a second component that is going to be a function of the number of intermediate inputs that go into the process. So it's going to be a function of this n over there. And of course, this is an extremely simple, highly stylized model, and you would never want to take this model to the data. However, it illustrates in a very simple way what the connection is between the number of goods and this one-time increase in TFP. If you have two countries, and again, in many of these models, it's assumed that these countries are symmetric. If you have two countries that are in autarky and then they get together and they trade with each other, this number of products is going to double, it's going to increase, and this is going to lead to increases in total factor productivity. One more thing I want to mention about this type of model. So obviously this model builds in this law of variety effect, right? So by assumption there's a law of variety, so it's going to give you this result. But one nice feature I think of this model is it's also a story about how trade promotes growth within the firms. So it's in some sense different from the models we see lately in trade, and they have become extremely popular, where they emphasize firm heterogeneity And as a result, they emphasize the selection mechanisms. So you have the less efficient firms exiting the market, the more efficient firms staying in the market when we have trade. And it's this process of selection that results in gains from trade and from growth. So in this type of models, you don't need that. It's all happening within the firm. So it's a different type of story. Okay. This is the very simple theory, and the most compelling evidence, the most compelling empirical evidence supporting this mechanism so far has been provided in a paper by Amiti and Konings. This paper is a reduced form paper, but it makes the connection between reductions in input tariffs in Indonesia and total factor productivity increases in firms in Indonesia. So because it's a reduced form approach, we cannot be sure that this is the mechanism at work. However, because the identification strategy is fairly credible, and I will come to a moment, so the identification is achieved by exploiting these decreases in input tariffs, the results are fairly credible. There is another paper by Halpern, Koren, and Zeidel that can offer more direct evidence on the mechanism. So this is a paper where the authors have actually data directly on the imported inputs, so they can show how imports of intermediate products are associated with higher TFP. They don't have a trade liberalization episode there, but they do have the data on intermediate inputs, so they can look at the mechanism directly. So I think in the meantime there have been many more papers for several countries conducting exercises similar to this one. So these are only two examples. It's by no means an exhaustive list. One potential problem with these studies is that I talked about measurement problems before, and anyone who has worked with firm level data in TFP knows that the measurement of TFP is very problematic in the studies because you cannot really, usually you don't have the luxury of having both price and output data. So you have a revenue measure in which markup and efficiency are confounded. So you can never be sure that this is efficiency as opposed to markup. Okay, but this is a note on the side. Now, what about the growth effect in these models? So the growth effect operates as follows. You can think of trade having two effects in the short run. First, trade results in lower prices of imported products. So this is the pure price effect. When tariffs decrease, the prices of the products that get imported are going to go down. And then there's a second effect, namely that trade may bring new products to the domestic country. And I will call that the variety effect. Essentially, these two effects can be captured through changes in the exact import price index. So the exact price index is accordingly going to have two components. There is the conventional price index, which simply captures the changes in the prices of existing products. And then there is the variety component, which captures the fact that essentially when you have new products coming to the country, this is very much, this can be modeled as an increase in the exact price index. Why? You can think of these products that were not imported before as having a notional price, a virtual price that was equal to zero, that was equal to some value that implied zero imports. In some models, this notional price is infinity. So when you start importing this product, then this price goes down from whatever the notional value, whatever the virtual price was, to the value we observe post-liberalization. And this price decrease is essentially going to move the exact price index down. Okay, so these are these two components. So in sum, you can think of the import of these new intermediate products as a development that is going to push down the exact price index of intermediates. So this is how you want to model it. What are the implications for growth? Now consider a domestic firm that faces a fixed cost of introducing a new product. This decrease in the price of intermediate products that may result from trade is going to imply that the firm is more likely to introduce domestic products. So you have a variety in, variety out effect. You import more varieties, as a result you produce more varieties. And this now is likely to have a feedback effect. So some of these products are going to be intermediate products themselves. So they can be used as inputs in the production of other domestic products. Some of these products are going to be final goods, but even there you may get positive effects on growth if there are externalities. So if you think that the fixed cost of production is decreasing in the number of products, then this is also going to promote growth. Then there is also a third effect that is also emphasized in some other versions of these models, And this effect provides a direct link between these imported intermediates and research activities. Namely, some versions of these models emphasize that in order to conduct research or development, you actually need to import products from abroad. So that's especially the case for developing countries that may need to import these products from more developed countries. And this is going to create a direct link between imported intermediates and R&D. So more formally, let me just give you briefly the production technology, a production technology that's a little more flexible and empirically more desirable than the simple model I wrote down before. Suppose that we have constant returns to scale, and the final output is again produced according to a Cobb-Douglas production function using capital, labor, and intermediates. But now these intermediate products, I distinguish between different intermediate products, and I consider them to be essential in the production in the sense that if one of them is equal to 0, then you cannot produce anything, right? So for each of these intermediate products, xi, we can also distinguish between a domestic aggregate and a foreign aggregate, an imported aggregate. So in this notation, this is the xd and the xf. So the xd is a domestic aggregate, and the xf is the imported aggregate. This imported aggregate, so the xf, is again a composite that consists of different varieties of imported intermediate products. And I follow here the convention in trade to consider products that come from different countries as being imperfect substitutes. So this corresponds to the Armington assumption. For example, if you have a particular product, let's say rubber, but it comes from different countries, then each version that comes from a different country is going to be considered a different variety. So this results into a 3-nest production function. It's still very restrictive. All these products are combined according to the CS aggregator, which is a very restrictive functional form, and I've criticized it myself before, but it's a little more flexible than what one had before. So given this production technology, one can show that the exact price index for a particular input sector is going to be decomposed to 2 terms. The first term, the P term, is the conventional price index. So this is what you would get if you didn't have any new varieties. So with trade, for example, tariffs go down, the prices of imported inputs go down, this P would go down. And then there is the second term, the capital lambda, that captures the variety effect. So it captures the fact that the price of these intermediates goes down from the virtual price to a finite price. And this I'm going to call the variety component of the exact input price index. So I don't want to throw too much algebra here and too much notation, but let me just spend a few minutes on this lambda term to make clear why this is a little more flexible than the initial model. So this lambda term, again, consists of the ratio of, okay, let me put it this way. What comes into this lambda, the capital lambda term, is the relative expenditures that are spent on new products, on new intermediate products, relative to the expenditures on the total set of products that were available to the economy before the new varieties came in. So the advantage of this is that you don't simply count products, which can be fraught with problems, because some of these problems, new products that come in, may be perfect substitutes for products that you already had in the economy, or perfect substitutes for domestic products. This specification is a little more flexible because it allows it lets the expenditure data speak as to how important these new varieties are. Okay. On top of that, this term also depends on this elasticity of substitution. So in the extreme case, suppose that these products are perfect substitutes, then this elasticity of substitution would be infinity, and then you would end up with this lambda term being equal to 1. So then the variety effect would not be important at all. Let me just give you one example of why this has empirical content. So people usually criticize these models because there is this love of variety effect that's built in. So one tends to always find that trade and imports of new varieties are going to have positive welfare effects. So there is a study on Costa Rica by Akolakis and Rodriguez and other people who actually find that the effects of trade liberalization were extremely small. When they count varieties, they found that there are many new products that come into the country. But when they apply this method to actually capture the welfare gain that arises from trade, they find very small effects. And this is entirely driven by the fact that the expenditures on these new products are very small. And their conclusion is that the imported products were already imported prior to the liberalization. Then the country opens up, but the new varieties that come in are not that important, and people don't spend much money on them. So even though there is this love of variety built in, there is still empirical content, because in principle you can get very small effects by applying this. Okay? So what this implies is that ultimately the price index for the input sector is going to have three terms. There is the first term that is going to capture the price of domestic products, and then there is the second term that is going to capture the effect of the imported products. And as I said before, the second term can be decomposed further to the conventional price index and to this lambda term that captures the variety effect. Okay. Now, given all this, you can rewrite the minimum cost function as follows. That's the equation down there. This minimum cost function has essentially three terms. There is the first term that captures the effect of the conventional price index. There is the second term that captures the variety effect, and there is this third term that I labeled stuff. And this stuff includes, among other things, the prices of domestic products. It's also going to include the prices of labor and capital and total factor productivity. And the one point I want to make now is that if in an empirical specification, if you consider this stuff to be the error term, then by construction, by the very nature of these models, this is going to be correlated with the right-hand side variables, because the essence of these endogenous growth models is that you have these new imported products that come in. So the new imported intermediates, these are going to decrease the P and the lambda, but they're also going to lead to the introduction of new domestic products, which is going to affect the domestic prices. So therefore, by construction, whatever goes into this term that I labeled stuff is going to be correlated with what's on the right-hand side. And this is one of the challenges that this literature faces. You may observe in the data that you have growth and that you have new imported intermediates, but you cannot be sure that this is not entirely driven by the correlation of this error term with the right-hand side variables. And that's exactly where trade liberalization is going to be helpful. So to continue on the mechanism, as I mentioned above, there is also a direct, so far I've focused on the introduction of new domestic varieties. There is also a direct effect that may arise from the effect of these new intermediates on the research activity. Okay, so to summarize the mechanism, trade liberalization has two margins. There is an intensive margin. It lowers prices of imported intermediates, but there's also an extensive margin. It leads to new imported products. As a result, the minimum unit cost associated with the production of a domestic product falls. Domestic producers may find it more profitable to start producing products that were unprofitable prior to the liberalization. And this introduction of the new domestic varieties further contributes to growth. Why? If they're intermediate products, it's the same argument as before. We have this feedback effect. And if they're domestic consumer products, then you may have externalities with their effect on fixed costs. Now, this is the theory. And why is it so difficult to bring this theory to the data? The theory has been around for many years. There's nothing new there. However, there has been relatively little empirical work until recently examining this type of mechanism for growth in developing countries. One of the main challenges is that until recently, there was no information on the domestic product. So there are plenty of trade data that report very accurately what the new products are that countries import as a result of trade liberalization, but we had no data about what firms exactly do, what products they produce. The same applies to a certain extent to research and development, though the data there was better. The second issue that I mentioned briefly before is that you also had a very serious problem of potential reverse causality between imports of new intermediates and the outcomes of interest. And just to express that in simple terms, if you observe the introduction of many new domestic products and then you observe imports of new intermediates, you don't know which caused which. So it could be that there is a domestic demand shock, And as a result, domestic firms expand and they start producing new domestic products. And in order to do that, they start also importing new products. But it was not trade or trade liberalization that caused this growth in the first place. Okay, so these are two of the challenges that the literature faced in the past. And as I said before, these are the two advantages we have now. We have better data at the plant or the firm level for many developing countries, but also for developed countries. We have such data for the US, and people have used them for the US. The problem with the US is you don't have a nice trade liberalization experiment to address the second problem, so the potential reverse causality between imports and the outcomes of interest, which is something you do have for many developing countries. Okay? So given that my point is that we have a lot of data, let me briefly come to the data. So here is the case of India. The data I've used in my own work come from the so-called Prowers database, which is a database collected by the Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy. And this is a data set that covers about 60 to 70% of the economic activity in the industrial sector. The panel data we use in this, in the study I'm going to refer to, cover the period 1989 to 2003, which is a period of major reforms. But the survey is going on, so you can get data for as recently as 2008 now. It covers the medium and large Indian firms, so it's not a particularly good data set to study entry and exit because the small firms are not there, but it's a very good database if you want to consider changes in the product mix decisions of firms. So if you are trying to understand what exactly is it that firms who remain active do. And finally, one great advantage that one has if one works on India is precisely because India was so highly regulated in the past. So of course the industrial regulation is always criticized, but one advantage of this regulation was that we often have very good data. For example, the 1956 Companies Act required firms to disclose product information. So in this database, there is a product module that reports very detailed product information, and this information includes what product the firms produce, the sales, but also the unit values. So you have prices, which is a great advantage if you try to estimate TFP, for example. So we end up with about 1,886 products. This implies that the product definitions, the product classifications are very detailed. So for the US, for example, there have been similar studies by Bernard, Redding, and Schott, BRS. They have about 1,500 products. So for India, you actually have a more detailed product classification. And it turns out that this product module covers about 85% of manufacturing output. So it's a fairly comprehensive data set. Let me just give you, I don't know if you can read it. So this is an example of what kind of products you find in these data sets. So you have a general industry description, basic metal industries, that's the sector. And conditional on that, you have a more detailed industry description, for example, manufacture of basic iron and steel. And then you have a list of very detailed product descriptions, pig iron, sponge iron, and so on. Okay, let me just say that this is by no means unique to India. So there are similar data sets that are now available for many developing countries, especially Latin America. So for example, for Colombia and Brazil, there are similar data sets which actually, in many ways, are superior to the Indian ones in terms of quality. There are also similar data sets for many European countries, but this will bring me to the second point, that in these European countries we may not have the experiments, the policy experiments that we have for developing countries. So in short, the point I'm trying to make is that these data are widely available now, and by using them we can actually make substantial progress in addressing these questions. A few words about the Indian trade liberalization. So why can it help us address the reverse causality question? So India was highly regulated until about 20 years ago. So people have written a lot about the labor regulation that was extremely strict, and the labor laws that prevented firms from laying off workers. But on top of that, there was an industrial regulation, so the infamous license Raj, that in the context of what I'm talking about, required firms to obtain official permission in order to introduce a new product. So this means that the sunk costs of introducing a new product in India were enormous. On top of that, the trade regime was highly restrictive, so there were high tariffs on the final goods, but there are also high tariffs on intermediate inputs. And just, for the sake of comparison, The Economist reported that in 1985, the tariff on intermediates in India was about 150%. Around the same time in the Philippines, it was 22%. In China, I think it was 79%. So in India, the input tariffs were extremely high. And this implied that it was very hard for firms to gain access to these intermediate inputs that were important for production. Now comes the trade liberalization. So India started liberalizing in 87. Okay, they started bringing non-tariff barriers down. But when one looks at this trade liberalization, one has the usual political economy concerns. Liberalization is not random. There is a reason that some sectors liberalize and some others do not. And so it's not clear that you can actually use that as a plausibly exogenous experiment to identify the effects of trade on growth. On the other hand, in 1991, India faced a major balance of payment crisis, and at this point, it decided to bring in the IMF. And one condition that the IMF imposed in order to provide help was that India would liberalize massively across all sectors. The way this worked is that political economy became completely irrelevant. So specific sectors or lobbying interests had no say by how much tariffs would be reduced. One of the objectives of the trade liberalization was to bring the tariffs to a uniform level. And what this means is that if an industry had very high tariffs to start with at the beginning of the period, then this industry had to reduce the tariffs by a proportionally larger amount in order to bring it down to the same level that the other industries had. On average, the nominal tariffs went down from 90% to about 30%, so it was a major decrease. So here is a graph that shows what happened to tariffs between 91, when the IMF came in, and 97. We stop at 97 because after that there is evidence that the political economy concerns became more pronounced again. And more importantly, if one worries about the exogeneity of these trade changes, here is a graph that shows what happens to the dispersion of tariffs. So the yellow line shows what happened to the mean, and the mean went down. So it went down from 90 to 30%. But most importantly, the dispersion went down. So the dispersion is given by the red line. What this means is that a perfect predictor of how much a sector would liberalize was the initial tariff rate. Okay, sectors with high tariff rates would liberalize more. So what this means from an econometric point of view is, number one, we have differential changes across sectors. So it's not just that India liberalizes, because that gives you just one macroeconomic point that you cannot use for identification. Okay, so that wouldn't be sufficient. There is a second thing that's very helpful here, which is that different sectors experience different changes in tariffs. And this is what one can exploit for identification. So first you have these differential changes across tariffs that are motivated by the desire to reduce the dispersion of tariffs. And second, I'm arguing that these differential changes were economically at least exogenous because they were dictated by the desire of the IMF to reduce the dispersion. Now you may say this is just fortuitous, that just happened to be the case in India. And so in this case we are lucky, but this is not an argument that applies generally to developing countries. Actually, it turns out that this is an argument you can make for many developing countries, though for different reasons. So for example, many countries in Latin America liberalized when they became members of the WTO. There was actually a transition period, so they didn't have to liberalize immediately. But once they decided to liberalize, again, the liberalization was completely dictated by the WTO. They had to bring dispersion down, meaning that political economy became irrelevant, and those sectors with high tariff rates, they had to reduce tariff by more. So there is evidence that this was the case in Colombia, in Brazil. There is also evidence that the same was true in Indonesia. India, as I mentioned, shows the same pattern, though for different reasons. This is the IMF coming. So my point is that these tariff reductions can actually be used to identify these causal effects of trade. And this is a big advantage we have post-90 compared to earlier years. Okay, now of course this doesn't necessarily imply that these tariff changes are going to be econometrically exogenous, and this is something that the econometric work has to deal with, but at least in the economic sense, the political economy concerns are less pronounced here compared to other studies. I should also mention that people have looked more carefully. For example, Petya Topalova has looked very carefully at whether these tariff reductions were correlated with any other industry-specific trends or initial levels of capital labor ratio, unemployment, wages. There is no evidence that the tariffs were correlated with anything, at least until 97. Okay, this so this data that I mentioned, the data, the firm level data, plus the data on tariff liberalization, can be also supplemented with import data. The import data have always been available at an extremely disaggregate level. So by combining this data with the other data sets that I just mentioned, one has a very comprehensive picture of the economy. The big challenge when one does this type of work is you have to match definitions across data sets, and this is an extremely tedious enterprise, but it's doable. Let me also mention briefly that I just gave you some product descriptions. In order to determine whether these products are intermediates or capital goods, we rely on a classification provided by NRES, but an alternative way of doing that is by looking at the input-output tables. So another piece of information that's available to the researchers these days is input-output tables. And we use these input-output tables here at the aggregate level, but now these input-output tables are becoming also available at a much more disaggregate level. Okay? So here are some examples of what products we're talking about. So when it comes to consumer products, you have things like jewelry, air conditioning, video recording. When it comes to intermediates, you have things like electrical transformers, electromagnets, and so on. So they're again extremely detailed, and the classification in many ways seems to make sense. So now let me come to the evidence. So I argued before that by using these data sources and this identification strategy that relies on these differential changes of tariff reductions, we can actually provide evidence of the significance of this micro mechanism that promotes growth. So the evidence I'm going to present comes in three parts. So the first part is going to be purely descriptive. So I'm just going to show you some facts that set the stage. They don't imply causality, and there are no conclusions one can draw from these facts. Second, I will come to the reduced form analysis. So in the reduced form analysis, I will show you evidence how the input tariff reductions that I argued are plausibly exogenous relate to the expansion of domestic products and R&D. And then I will show you, time permitting, the results from what I call semi-structural part, where I impose more structure in order to identify the particular channels. So the particular question I'm interested in is, to the extent that we do find that there was an expansion in domestic products and R&D, is it because there was simply a price effect and trade liberalization made imports cheaper, or is it because we really had imports of new varieties? So is the variety channel really the important one? Okay, so first let me talk briefly about the facts. In some previous work, we looked at data for India and asked the question, how important are new products, not imports, but new domestic products for growth? It turns out new products are quite important for growth. They account for approximately 1/4 of growth in manufacturing, so 25%. Now, one thing that's very interesting about India is that the net figure is equal to the gross figure. And that seems to be very specific to India. There is no product dropping. So there has been some recent work on the US, for example, by BRS, who conduct the same exercise. Interestingly, they also report that the extensive margin, so product churning, product creation and product destruction account for 20% of output growth. But in their case, product destruction is very important. So there is evidence of this selection mechanism and of creative destruction. In India, you don't find any evidence of creative destruction. There is no destruction, period. There are no products that are discontinued. Firms keep producing the same products, but they add much more. So you look at the Indian data, and your first impression is this is not a story about creative destruction. This is a story about growth. This is a story about product additions. And perhaps this is not that surprising, given the industrial regulation of the past. It's actually plausible that the firms faced very high sunk costs when they introduced these new products, so they're not eager to take them away from to take them out of the production line when you have trade reforms. Another explanation is that India is also a very large developing country where you have huge income disparities. So it might make sense for these firms to keep producing these older products, and they go to a different segment of the consumer market. So, but in short, there is no concern that you have these new imports displacing domestic products. Okay. So, in short, if you look at the domestic products, there is not just growth, but there is expansion of the production lines. At the same time, if you look at the imports, you see that the Indian liberalization was real in the following sense. It certainly implied higher import volumes. It did imply lower unit values, lower prices, and it also implied more import varieties. So I won't show you regressions that document this, but I will show you the following decomposition table, and I hope you can see it. So in the first column, you see the import growth. Growth is tremendous in that period, so imports grow by 130%, but imports of intermediates grow by 227%. So growth of intermediates is extremely important. You can decompose this growth into an extensive and an intensive margin. And the extensive margin refers to the new products that get imported. You can see that this is extremely important. It's about 153%. In contrast, the intensive margin is smaller. It's 74%. Okay? Now, it's interesting to look a little bit deeper into what drives this extensive and intensive margin in India. And again, I'm not sure if you can see that, but within the extensive margin, so we have a growth rate of 153%, and out of these 115% come from OECD countries, so they come from new countries, OECD countries, more developed countries, plus Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. So these are the countries that we would consider to be more developed. Only 38% of these new products come from the rest of the world. Now, within the intensive margin, so I call that the intensive margin, but this may be misleading because this intensive margin has itself an extensive margin, and by that I mean the following. You may be importing the same products that you imported before, but now India is importing these products from different countries. So it is an intensive margin, but actually there is an extensive component to it because you are bringing them from different countries, which means they may very well be imperfect substitutes. And in fact, one thing you see in the data very clearly is that these new products are associated with higher unit values. So at the minimum, they're differentiated. Okay, so in summary, you have an explosion of, so these are some examples of new products, just to show you that this was real. So it's not just a matter of semantics or of how you define products. You have computer input or output, units, digital computer, CPU. So you really have products that seem new. So just to summarize, you have two things that go together. You have an explosion in the number of domestic products, and at the same time, you have an explosion in imports, especially intermediate imports, and these intermediate imports tend to be new products that come from OECD countries. So that was part one, and of course this doesn't imply that it's trade that causes these domestic products. But let's now go to the second step. Let's look at the reduced form evidence. So now let's relate these changes in the input tariffs. By the way, we take these tariff changes, we pass them through the input-output table, and we create measures of input tariffs. So by how much tariffs change in each input sector. So you do that, and then you can run the following reduced form regression, and I have to emphasize this is just reduced form, that relates the number of products that produced in each firm to these input tariff reductions. By the way, I'm showing you here the simplest possible specification, but this is robust to anything we tried, including different techniques for estimating count data models. And so here are the main results. So you find a very large and significant effect of input tariff reductions on the number of new products that are produced by firms. It's interesting to note that you find no such evidence when it comes to output tariffs or when you put more controls such as FDI, delicensing, and so on. And just to give you the economic interpretation of these results, during these periods, input tariffs fell by approximately 24 percentage points. According to these results, this leads to a 7.7% increase in firm product scope. This is about 31% of the product scope expansion. And I argued before that product scope expansion accounts for approximately 1/4 of manufacturing growth. So you put these numbers together, and you find that this particular channel, which is a very, very specific channel, so I'm just talking about input tariffs and nothing else, accounts for approximately 8% of the overall manufacturing growth. So this is, during that time, manufacturing output in India grows by 200%. So this is output, not value added. So this implies that you have a growth, the input tariffs account for approximately 16% of these, which is a large number. By the way, these input tariffs are also associated with other outcomes that we associate with growth. For example, you can use TFP as the dependent variable, R&D. You find the same patterns, and what's interesting for R&D, you actually find an effect only for the larger firms. So you don't find an average effect, but you do find that those firms who are more likely to engage in R&D, namely the larger firms, are likely to be affected by the tariffs. So there is some evidence of a heterogeneous treatment there. So I think the reduced form evidence is very telling, and it fits nicely with some other work that has been done in the same spirit. For example, I mentioned Amity and Konix that shows input tariffs have very significant, and I would claim credible effects on various outcomes that we associate with growth. So the next step is to try to impose some additional structure in order to assess what exactly drives these effects. So is it just the price effect, or is it really the new varieties that drive this growth? Now, let me also point out that the disadvantage of imposing structure is that to a certain extent the results are going to be sensitive to the functional forms used, while the reduced form analysis does not have this problem. So I'll just outline the main steps. I don't have the time to go over this in detail, but remember we had this minimum cost function that distinguished between these three components: a component that captures the conventional price index, a component that captures the variety index, and this error term, now I'm going to call it error term for empirical purposes. And again, you can see very clearly what goes into this error term. It's domestic prices, the wages, interest rate, and total factor productivity. So it's going to be for sure correlated with the right-hand side variables. So what are the next steps? Number one, we can actually compute these exact price indices. We can also compute the conventional price index separately, and we can compute the variety component for each sector precisely because we do have the price data, we do have the expenditure data in order to do that. Then you can run these things through the input-output tables to create the input price indices. And then you can try to relate the changes in firm product scope, not simply to input tariffs, but to these different components of the exact price index. So you can try to rely the changes in product scope separately to the changes in the conventional price index versus the change in the variety component to see which one accounts for the change. So let me just show you one table that shows how important these new varieties were. So I showed you the numbers, and the growth in imported inputs. But here is the mean variety index that we compute for this period. So if these new imported varieties are not important, then you would get an index that's equal to 1. So the lower the index is, the farther it is, the farther away it is from 1, the bigger the effect of new varieties is. The overall variety index, so the aggregate variety index over this period for intermediates is 0.62. Okay, so what this implies is that the aggregate price index falls by about 4.7% per year because of these new varieties. This is a huge number by any means. So I mentioned before that people have done some similar calculations for the US and Costa Rica. The effect for India is orders of magnitude larger. And again, this suggests that the trade liberalization had very significant effects. It didn't just decrease prices, it brought in new varieties. And these new varieties, as indicated by the share of expenditures that actually went to these varieties, had a very significant effect on welfare. Then, so we take these price indices, we put them to the input-output tables. And then one more thing I want to show you quickly is that if you try to ask the question, so these price indices go down over time, is it because of tariffs? Then you do find that input tariffs are highly correlated. This is especially true for the variety index. So the variety index is highly correlated with input tariffs, and input tariffs explain about 0.47% of the variance. So, it seems that it's really input tariffs that drive these indices down. So here are the main results from running OLS regressions. So take the change in the firm scope between the first and the last year in our sample and regress it on the price index plus these two components, and ask the question, which of the two components is more important? Is it the conventional price index, or is it the log variety, or is it the variety component that's more important? Then the answer is unambiguously that it's the variety index that accounts for the change. The conventional price index is not significant. It's very small. It's not significantly different from zero. And apart from significance, it's also economically very small. Okay? Now, these are simply OLS regressions, and I argued these things are clearly endogenous. So the next thing we do is instrument for these price indices. And how do we instrument? Again, that's where the input tariffs are very helpful. We use the basic identification assumption we use is that these terms that go into the error term are going to be affected only through input tariffs. So input tariffs affect the prices of imported products, and this in turn are going to affect the domestic prices and total factor productivity. This is very consistent, very much consistent within these models, but it may of course not be consistent with other explanations of total factor productivity or domestic prices. So if you believe this identification assumption, then you can use input tariffs as instruments, and we do that in two ways. And we do that so that we can construct two different instruments, since we have two different components. The first component is the tariffs, the input tariffs, and the second instrument is the interaction of these input tariffs with sector-specific measures of the fixed costs that exporting countries may face when they try to export it into the Indian market. So the idea is conditional on the tariff change. If you are an exporter in a country that has a lower fixed cost of entering the Indian market, let's say because you speak English, then you are more likely to enter this market. It turns out that also creates cross-sectional variation because the set of potential exporters differs across sectors. Okay, so we have different sets of exporters, of potential exporters across sectors, and these different sets of exporters face different fixed costs of entering the Indian market. So I'm almost out of time, so just to give you the brief overview of the results, when we estimate these using instrumental variables, the results are substantially stronger, so the variety effect is 3 times as large as what I showed you before. And we also find the same to be true about R&D. So in short, the empirical evidence suggests that, assuming you believe the identification assumptions, that these new varieties are important, that trade liberalization was important, and that this effect operates through new varieties. It's not simply new prices. So let me just conclude. What did the evidence show? I showed you that these new products accounted for approximately a quarter of the Indian manufacturing growth in the 90s. The imports of intermediates surged, And 2/3 of this growth was accounted for by new products, completely new products. So what we can do by using these data sources I mentioned above is try to connect these two facts. And if you connect these two facts and use this trade liberalization as a plausible exogenous shock that helps with identification, then the conclusion is that it was the firm's access to new inputs from abroad that led to a product scope expansion, and also that these new inputs were associated with R&D. So in that sense, this provides empirical support for the microeconomic mechanism of domestic variety expansion as an engine of growth. Let me also say that this is just the beginning, and there is much more you can do with this data because you actually follow these products over time. So you have their prices, you have their sales, you have their contribution to the firm revenue. You also have from the input-output tables, you know exactly how they are used. You know in which other products they are used as inputs. So you have the full picture. And so these data are really ideal for addressing precisely this endogenous growth question. Are these new products contributing to growth or not? So final remarks. I talked about India, and I hope I managed to convince you that the mechanism and the data are not unique to India. And in principle, one could apply the same analysis to many developing countries, especially in Latin America. Let me also mention briefly some anecdotal evidence that is very much supportive of this mechanism. So one of my co-authors, Amit Kandelwal, visited the Coca-Cola bottling factory in Shanghai. And this is a highly automated facility. We all think of China as being a manufacturing powerhouse that can do anything. It turns out in this factory, all the equipment used is imported from Germany or the US. So even though you think of China as a country that can produce anything, and a country that has become a main player in manufacturing, still they cannot produce things unless they import capital and other intermediates from abroad. So the anecdotal evidence seems to provide very strong support for this story, at least for developing countries. And I would like to close with a quote that comes from my colleague Paul Krugman, but I think very accurately captures the essence of these models. This is a quote that emphasizes the role of imports as opposed to exports. And again, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that trade is not just about exports, which have been overly emphasized in recent work in trade, but more importantly, it's about imports. And as Krugman said, moreover, the purpose of international trade, the reason it's useful, is to import, not to export. And that is, what the country really gains from trade is the ability to import things it wants. Exports are not an objective in and of themselves. The need to export is a burden that the country must bear because its import suppliers are crass enough to demand payment. Okay? So I think this captures very well the basic point I wanted to make, and thank you very much.
Just to make 2 points. One is, thank you very, very much, and just picking up on where Penny left off, I think there's two sort of things that I took out of it. One was that this is sort of applied micro meets trade, and I'd encourage those of you interested in this area to push further in these directions. Particularly interesting with the fact you could actually get into some of the mechanisms that linked trade and growth in the Indian context, which you couldn't do in the cross-country literature. And secondly, picking up on the Krugman comment, I mean, when you think about the welfare consequences of these changes in policy, they're just so massive that it's difficult to sort of stay away from that point, which was not emphasized in the talk. But anyway, when you've been observing India over the last 10, 15 years, the consequences of these policies in welfare terms are really massive. So anyway, just to close by saying thank you again to Penny for giving the Sargan lecture this year. Thank you.
Thank you.